I'm delighted that we're living at this time in history where we're talking about the essence of humanity. What does it mean to be human? These are the big questions that we've grappled with for millennia, but it's really at the pointy end now, isn't it?
The AI Grapple, where the future begins.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the AI Grapple podcast, where we explore the fascinating world of artificial intelligence and its profound impact on our lives and businesses. Today, I have the privilege of hosting the incredible Tracey Spicer AM, a true luminary in the fields of journalism and advocacy. Tracey is a multiple Walkley award-winning author, journalist and broadcaster who has graced our airwaves on national programs for ABC TV and radio, Network 10 and Sky News. Tracey's accolades are numerous, from being named the New South Wales Premier's Woman of the Year to accepting the Sydney Peace Prize along Tarana Burke for the Me Too movement. In 2018, Tracey was recognised as one of the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence, and her dedication to media and charity work has earned her the prestigious Order of Australia. Tracey's latest book, Man-Made: How the Bias of the Past is Being Built into the Future, delves into the critical issues of bias in AI. And that is why I have invited her to join me today, and I am thrilled about the conversation we're about to have. So welcome, Tracey. It is wonderful to have you here on the AI Grapple podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing and I can't wait to have this chat.
Wonderful. Well, as I was just saying to you before we started, I am 50% thrilled and exhilarated about the potential of AI and 50% terrified at the potential of what could happen. And as I listened to your book twice now, I've listened to the audio version of your book and have just been engrossed in grappling with some of these issues. So I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation with you. But let's dive right on in. I mean, you have a really impressive background in journalism, broadcasting, advocacy. But I'm really interested, what is it that sparked your interest in particular with AI? And why do you feel that it's really important now to address some of the issues of bias in AI?
I really did have a light bulb moment about this when my then 11-year-old son, about 8 years ago, said, "Mum, I want a robot slave." In a moment of appalling parenting, my husband and I had allowed him to watch South Park, the adult cartoon series, so we could get an extra half-hour sleep in the morning. You know what it's like when you've got younger kids, that extra half hour means the world. And in one episode, Cartman, a very naughty boy, was ordering around his Amazon Alexa like he was some kind of colonial master. The reason why it was a light bulb moment is because as a lifelong feminist and journalist, I realised all of a sudden that this idea about women and girls being servile in the home was being built into the chatbots that will be running our futures effectively. And I very quickly learned that the chatbots for the home are deliberately programmed to have female voices because traditionally we view women as servile, whereas the chatbots in the business and finance sector overwhelmingly have male voices because traditionally they're viewed as having more credibility and gravitas. And honestly, that sent me right down the rabbit hole. The other reason why I decided to write an 80,000 word book about this is I'm a woman in her mid-50s and I really do want to keep up with technology because I'm certainly not a Luddite. I'm one of those people who believes technology, particularly powered by AI, can do wonderful things for humanity in the workplace, but we need to put those guardrails around it. So I wanted to learn enough about it that I could speak relatively eloquently for someone who's not a technologist.
Oh, I can't wait to explore some of those issues with you today. It's interesting when you talk about the voice. I had a moment the other day. So when I use ChatGPT with my kids, and I do with supervision, and our Amazon Alexa is also programmed with a male voice. So they have only heard ChatGPT being a male voice and Amazon Alexa being a male voice. But interestingly, I had a moment the other day where my 8-year-old said, Mum, we should call him Alex, and he knows everything. And I was like, oh, isn't that interesting? Because if you look at that through a different lens, I've done the male voices for exactly the reason that you've talked about. What's the flip side of that, though, with my kids then thinking that it's this all-knowing male that has the answers to all of their questions? And I was actually having a conversation with my best friend about this, that maybe we need to alternate the voices on a 24-hour basis so that they get a mixture of voices. But I'm really interested in your perspective on how we address that challenge around the voice technology.
Yes, a lot of people have said to me that they quite like having a female voice, for example, in the GPS in the car, because it does seem authoritative. She's the one telling them where they need to go. But the United Nations did a report. It was called I'd Blush If I Could, about 7 or 8 years ago. And it discovered that when people get frustrated with their female voiced chatbots, either in the car or in the house, they abuse them either in really sexist, denigrating terms, you dumb blonde, you idiot, you stupid bitch. They would actually throw their physical manifestation of the chatbot, in the case of the Amazon Alexa, across the room and it would hit the wall. So what the researchers found was that when you have these stereotypical responses that end up being the abuse of something that resembles a woman or a girl, it really is replicating gendered violence in society. So the way that we can incorporate it into our households and cars and workplaces is exactly what you've done. Sit down with your kids and talk to them about the stereotyping and say, how do you feel when you hear this male voice or this female voice? What do you think that tells us about what's happening in society? You know, I had the great privilege of meeting the wonderful Gina Davis, the Hollywood actor and advocate on gender equity, several years ago. And I said to her, gosh, we're surrounded by a wallpaper of misogyny in the mass media. How do you talk to, your children and your family and the young people in your life about this? And she gave me really wise advice, which was always consume mass media, social media with the young people around you and just start a conversation, because conversations are what open people's eyes and change the world.
Yeah, it's really, I'm fascinated for our young people today, because when I started my company 15 years ago, it was the days of the wild, wild west with social media. And we're still grappling with a lot of those issues now, 15 years on. And every day in the work that I'm doing with AI, I feel like I'm back 15 years ago because we're grappling with some of the same issues. But I don't think we've got 15 years to get our heads around this. So how do you see, or when you talk about safety guardrails, where does the responsibility sit with that? How do we grapple with that as an issue and get that in place, other than obviously conversations with our children is critical, but how do we do that at a broader level to really make sure that we're not dealing in 15 years with some of the issues that we're still dealing with social media?
Like any change, it's multifaceted. I'm interested in what governments around the world are saying about how they failed in regulating and legislating social media all those years ago, and they're determined not to fail around artificial intelligence. However, what I've seen so far is pretty much the tech giants being beaten with a wet lettuce leaf. For example, they do have some quite decent legislation in New York around companies of a certain size using hiring algorithms. They must do an audit on them every single year because bias can creep in. But I think the fine is something like $250. It's very, very low. Unfortunately, America is beholden to the ethos of the free market economy. They don't want to rein in the tech giants because they want to have global domination in that area. And that makes perfect sense. What I would say is you can have your cake and eat it too. These companies can still make an enormous amount of money while having ethics, responsible AI, and what's now being called mindful AI built into the devices. A really good example is in the area of inclusive design. And by way of analogy, when Braille was developed, it was developed by someone with a sight impairment, one of the greatest innovations throughout history. For years beforehand, sighted people tried to develop something like that and they failed. So if you put inclusive design into AI devices, you broaden the number of people who can use them, it's more inclusive, and you can sell more units. So it's win-win. Where we're seeing some good regulation, though, is from the EU with its AI Act. It's a wonderful template that countries around the world can use. It's got a traffic light system on what is safe AI and what is not safe. And any countries doing business with EU countries will have to abide by this, which I think, down the track, which I think is absolutely fantastic. In Australia, the former Human Rights Commissioner, Ed Santow, did a 3-year report and recommended an AI safety commissioner because Australia, being a smaller English-speaking nation, is often seen as a testing ground for new devices. So there's a great role Australia could play. There's a really good roundtable at the moment that's looking at what we can do in Australia under the guidance of the Science Minister, Ed Husic. But one thing we could do is create a regulatory sandbox where if there's a new AI innovation, they test it out in a small group of people in a safe environment before it's unleashed on the general public. So there are a lot of things that we can do, but like any time in history, legislation lags with the advance of technology.
Yeah, and I think some of the legal cases that are unfolding at the moment, it'll be fascinating to see how that unfolds. I still see a model of the world in which the likes of ChatGPT could be taken down based on some of the ways that it's trained its data or it's trained its models with data. So I think it will be very interesting to see how that evolves. And it does look like some of that is evolving faster than it might have otherwise, because I think everyone sort of understands the importance of getting this right early on. When you talk about bias in your book, I've found myself reflecting a lot that, of course, we deal with these biases every day in society. These models have been trained by people, a certain subset of society who have one model of the world, one version of the world. And so in some ways, it's understandable that these models have biases. In all of the research that you did, where are you seeing a balance in that? So when we talk about, they talk about running out of good quality data to train these models and the use of, say, synthetic data. Is that one way I've asked you 2 questions in one, but is that one way that we can start to address some of those biases, is by actually creating data that counteracts some of those biases?
Yes, this is an area I'm fascinated by at the moment. And I'll start answering the question by explaining exactly how the bias is embedded for people who aren't familiar with the way AI innovations are created. It starts with the data sets, which are effectively big piles of videos and images and words. And inevitably, they're historical. They're from the past. So a lot of doctors are male, a lot of nurses are female. There's also something called dirty data and clean data. The companies can clean the data sets to reduce the amount of bias in them. But a lot of the tech giants don't want to spend that much money on it because they just want to keep sitting on their cash mountains. So that's the data, where the bias starts. Then even the algorithms can be biased. An algorithm, some people think of it as a mathematical equation. I think of it like a recipe. Every time you make a cake, you're using an algorithm. It's a step-by-step process. Overwhelmingly, the algorithms are created by young white men in Silicon Valley, right? So they put their own unconscious bias into the algorithms. Then the third step is machine learning, which in a way takes the biases from the first 2 steps and deepens them. I often characterize machine learning as being like a white supremacist going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory websites. If it's not supervised by humans, it can really go awry. So there's a couple of ways to reduce that kind of bias. I mean, one is to diversify the number of people who are programmers, to get some women and people from marginalised communities into the sector to reduce the amount of unconscious bias. But back at the level of data sets, there's some really creative things happening. And one of them is, as you mentioned, creating synthetic data. And then you can put a lot of that diversity and inclusion into the set from the get-go. Another thing that you can do is what's called create intentional bias. Bias is not always bad. An intentional bias, this movement, it's being spoken about a lot in the States, is to deliberately add that diversity into the data set and to not say all bias is bad, to say, look, we can use this to flip the script, to change the historical bias and create a future that's fairer, better, and equitable for everybody.
And so when we look at that bias, how do we stop, if we're using things like synthetic data or inbuilt biases, how do we stop it changing history? I mean, we've all seen the example of, Google Gemini creating the image of the founding fathers being very inclusive, but that's not reflective of history. So how do we find a balance between getting it right and ensuring that there's inclusivity and diversity whilst not changing history?
Exactly right. You don't want to be rewriting history. That's completely wrong. And every example I've seen of that, like the one that you've mentioned, is a ham-fisted attempt by the tech giants to put diversity and inclusion into their innovations, but without doing it in a nuanced way. And this is why we need really sophisticated audits of the data sets, the algorithms and the outputs. And those audits need to take place every year, because if you've just got the tech giants who reduced most of their ethics departments 18 months to 2 years ago doing tokenistic attempts like that, then it's not going to work. What you need are third parties who are more experienced and ethical about this stuff to come in and say we can do it in a way that has shades of grey, rather than you guys just trying to fix the problem by doing something in a ham-fisted way.
It's that bias has been so interesting over the last 18 months. I know I've tried to create the same image about 40 times, and every time I do it, I'm just interested. And what I'm trying to create is a middle-aged woman. Get that without, grey hair, wrinkles. And you either get the large-breasted, narrow waist or the really overweight, round, and finding... it strikes me that one of the ways to address that is for these models to ask more questions, so that rather than just taking a best guess based on bias or based on its history, that it actually asks more questions to get more nuance. And, if Sam Altman would only pick up the phone, I'd give him that advice. But this particular image that I'm trying to create, which is one for myself, I still haven't managed to nail it over it's been about 2 years now. And every time I hear of a major change in the algorithms or in the formulas, I try it again. And it's fascinating to see how that's evolved over time.
I love that idea of the models asking more questions to get nuance into it. That's absolutely brilliant. Because to your point, when we were trying to design the cover for my book, Man Made, the graphic designer Meng Coach wanted to start a conversation about the job losses in his sector because of apps like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion and DALL-E. For those of you who haven't used these apps, they scrape a whole bunch of images from the internet, billions of images, breaching copyright on the way, and create a so-called unique image that you then have allegedly ownership of. It took us 12 seconds to create the image for the cover. I wanted a strong, confident, robot-looking woman looking to the future with hope but concern. What came up was this gold, highly sexualized robot woman with a tiny waist, massive breasts, and huge biceps, looking at the camera with a come hither look and long eyelashes. Because the only way the algorithm read strong woman was as big biceps and huge boobs. So, to your point about older women, yes. A friend of mine from school, when I was researching the book, said, do you realise with the emojis for people, women of our age, the only one there is someone with wire-rimmed glasses, grey hair in a bun, wearing an apron like she's about to make an apple pie because the vicar's coming around for tea, And you're right, with women, it's either highly sexualised or that old and frumpy kind of image, almost from a 1950s picture book.
I wasn't sure whether I was going to share this situation with you, but I've decided I will. So this week I had a client who was saying that AI was rubbish and doesn't deliver a lot of value. And I said, have you had anyone give you a really good demo of what's possible with ChatGPT? And so I gave her a demonstration and, she was sort of impressed. And she said, well, Kate, put your name into ChatGPT and see what ChatGPT says about you. Now, what came out was fascinating to me, and I'm not sure I have all the answers around this yet, but it wrote an exceptional bio based on literally the latest work that I'm doing in the AI space. It was a fantastic bio that I will use some of. But one of the sentences in that bio said, Kate is a single mother of 2 young children and is limited in her ability to travel for work. Now, I gasped. Let's just say the demonstration went pear-shaped from then, because the client that I was showing this to was mortified and said, that's appalling. Now, what I've since realised is that my ChatGPT has learnt from what I have put into it. And there was a particular letter that I had asked for help writing where there was some mention of my restriction, in being able to travel all the time for work. And I immediately said, Kate is not limited in her ability to travel for work. She has plenty of support. And how dare you, reference that in a professional bio? And ChatGPT was suitably, I'm terribly sorry and I will amend my memory. Now, I've had multiple people test from an external perspective who are not within my ChatGPT environment. And what it says about me is very outdated about my work with social media. It doesn't mention AI at all. But it did strike me as what's to stop that being, because ChatGPT does turn on and off that ability for it to remember or not remember. There have been times I want to show people and that option's not there anymore. And so what stops, and it's a rhetorical question unless you have an answer, but what stops ChatGPT spitting that out when, an international event manager is looking for a speaker and chooses not to go with me because I have 2 young kids and I am apparently limited in my ability to travel?
Exactly. And that's where human supervision and oversight is so important. And also this movement called machine teaching on top of machine learning. And I'm kind of torn on this. I'd love to get your opinion on it. Machine teaching in its very basic form is exactly what you spoke about then. You sat down and you tried to teach ChatGPT to be better, to not put in those sexist comments. I had a friend who asked ChatGPT 9 times to tell a story about an engineer or a childcare worker or a pilot and a nurse. And every time it was gender stereotypical, every time it was a white person who lived in an urban environment, who was young, who lived without disability. So it was a very homogenized kind of ideal and stereotype from the past. And after 9 times, she turned around and said, ChatGPT, are you sexist? Are you racist? Are you ableist? And the robot got back to her and said, yes, you have taught me. Someone from Microsoft said to me a year and a half ago, oh, look, everything will be okay because now that our beta versions of our developments have gone out to the general public, everyone will teach them to be better. And I said, are you expecting us all to do unpaid labour to fix the problems that you have created? And he said, yeah, pretty much yes. So we can all do machine teaching to increase the diversity, but I don't like the idea of having to do that for free. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I do that a lot in Mid-Journey. I deliberately, they've got the option where you can select which image you like better. And I'm actually really happy to help make these models better because I want them to be better. And that's something, let's call it community service. I'm happy to do that for the greater good. There's some challenges that come up with that though, because the flip side could also happen. What happens if a competitor diligently trains the model in false information about a competitor? And so, like most things, I think it comes down to intent and who's using the technology. But I'm not sure that you can have one where the public is teaching these models to be better on bias and inclusivity and all of those things that we've talked about. And not have the opposite be true, where other people could be seeding in information that is not accurate. And who gets to determine, because we've seen with social media algorithms, who gets to determine what is fake news? Who gets to determine what is real or what's not real? And I think that's one of the challenges that we're going to face over the next few years, that as these guardrails and safety mechanisms get built in, is how do we allow one but stop the other? And I don't have answers to that question. I wish I did. So Tracey, on that, do you encourage people to correct AI when it gets it wrong? Do you advocate that as a strategy and a responsibility, I guess, that we all have?
Oh, Kate, I'm so sorry. It dropped out in the middle of your question. Would you mind saying that one again?
Yeah, I was just saying, is that something that you advocate for people to take that responsibility, and when they get information that is inaccurate or incorrect, that they actually take the time to do that? And do you feel like that actually makes a difference?
I advocate for everybody to use this constellation of technologies to see the benefits and the disadvantages and to try to weed out the bias over time. Because for example, if people over 50 stop using these technologies, stop using social media, stop putting our likes, our dislikes, our interests, our particular demographic into the corpus of these data sets, then the technology of the future won't take us into account in a really appropriate way. For example, medical technology is wonderful. These things are incredible. A computer in your hand, right? But I tried to buy a mobile phone for my dad in the last couple of years, and there were none on the market that he could use with his arthritic fingers. So the reason why we need to keep using these technologies and teach them to be better is they will rule our futures. And if we can't make them work, we'll lose job opportunities. We won't have medical technology that could save our lives. One example in my book is if you go to a hospital that uses an algorithm to work out who gets the scarce resources and you need a ventilator, say you've got COVID, and you're sitting next to a 30-year-old, in 100% of cases, the algorithm will give the ventilator to that 30-year-old because they're viewed as younger and more productive in a capitalist society. So we need to keep fighting the good fight to get ourselves heard in the technological future, in this fourth industrial revolution.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. So in your experience as a journalist and a broadcaster, how's AI changed media, for example, and what measures do you think should be implemented to ensure that AI-driven media tools don't, perpetuate the biases or reinforce those?
Yeah, in the media, it goes beyond bias to that huge issue of misinformation and disinformation that's polarising opinions around the world, leading to the rise of strongmen leaders like your Donald Trump, like your Bolsonaro in Brazil, who are taking advantage of things like deep fake technology, fake news, the algorithms on Facebook, for example, to manipulate the population with propaganda. It's an absolutely huge issue. People don't know what kind of media to trust anymore. I know a lot of friends in newsrooms are worried about losing their jobs, and in fact are losing their jobs at the moment because of artificial intelligence. Because an algorithm is like a mathematical equation and writing a news story is highly mathematical and formulaic, it's an easy area for AI to go into. For example, I read about a year ago that the largest selling newspaper in Europe, in Germany, a tabloid newspaper, is now using AI for all of its news stories. Certainly, it's having humans writing the political op-eds, the opinion pieces. It's got human oversight with editors and sub-editors and a news director still in the newsroom, but most of the rudimentary day-to-day news is being written by an algorithm, which is quite frightening. But again, the solution is simple but expensive. We need human oversight of these technologies. So the robot could write the news story, but you have a human running their eyes over it before it goes online.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the work I'm doing with businesses. There's still this feeling of how can we use AI to do less rather than how can we use AI to empower our people and to help our people do better, do more, have better, have more impact, increase productivity. And I think particularly for the next few years, as we go through this really rocky, where decisions will be made, where people's lives are lost, and where I think we're going to see some fairly extreme situations. We're already starting to see it where AI gets it wrong and where that has life or death implications for people. It's going to be rocky. I keep saying to people, buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride.
It
But
really
when
is. We can see it in the theatre of war. I mean, AI is advancing exponentially because of the military industrial complex, and every company wants to have the best AI to beat another country, whether it's in a competitive field or on the battlefield. We know that AI drones and weaponry were used in Ukraine. We know they were used in Libya. And recently they've also been used in the Middle East. Israel's got an AI-powered weapon called the Gospel. And certainly mistakes are made by people in the theatre of war and what they call the fog of war. But if AI makes a mistake, it makes it at scale, and that's terrifying. Having said that, I'm generally a glass half full kind of gal. It is the fourth industrial revolution. We've been through these before. Humans have come good. We just need to take control of the technology so it doesn't master us.
And interestingly, the company behind the autonomous drones in the Ukraine was a digital marketing agency just 3 years ago.
Is that right?
That's right. So when you look at who's behind some of the technology, and it's back to the days of the wild, wild west of social media. Before there was expertise, everyone's got a toe in the water and is having a go at this new AI world. And it's because it is so unregulated at the moment, it's very easy for people to be pivoting into the space without necessarily the experience and the wisdom. And I think it's one of the interesting things I'm seeing, and I'm interested in your reflections on this too, that for those of us who are a little older and who do bring a lot of wisdom and experience to the world, when powered by AI, that's the exciting opportunity, is that, I'm speaking to a lot of people who are not technologically savvy and who are fearful for their jobs and being replaced by technology. And I'm saying with your deep experience and wisdom, you actually have the ability to look at the output of these tools, to actually use these tools with some discernment rather than people who don't have the experience and hoping that AI is going to make them the expert.
I love that. Looking at these tools with discernment, that's a wonderful piece of advice. I have great hope and faith in the next generation and the generation after that because they are such global thinkers, they're digital natives. And if they're taught critical thinking at a young age, they will be able to help pull us back from the brink. And yes, that needs older people talking to younger people to try to open their eyes, because I know a lot of younger people are quite addicted to technology. They think it's all wonderful, the rose-coloured glasses. But with the wisdom of experience, we can say, look, we've seen a lot of technological developments in our lifetimes, and yeah, they can do great things, but think about this critically. I love the movement of teachers and university lecturers giving their students or attendees an essay written by ChatGPT and saying, now critically analyse this and send it back to me, because that's flipping it on its head and teaching young people to realise, oh gosh, this bot's hallucinated. There's bias here. This is just plain wrong. The footnote is from a Facebook page, not from a peer-reviewed paper. And that's how we start this golden age of critical thinking that we'll need for humanity to survive.
Oh, I love that. I get asked so many questions from educators around, and we see it in business too. There is still a bit of a feeling like using AI is cheating. It's, use your brain, do your job. Don't use technology to do that. And I love that educators have already figured that, that flip out and that paradigm shift. It really, yes, that gives me hope for our kids in terms of how they use this technology moving forward. So, Tracey, one of the things I'm fascinated about as we start to wrap up, I feel like we could talk about this all day. How do you reconcile using these tools in your life? I know you're a half glass full, but, how often do you use AI tools in your own life, and how are you using those, and how do you reconcile that with the downside or the empty part of the glass?
I use them every day because they're fun, and I'm very naughty. Recently, a friend had a 60th birthday, and I used an illegal app called 11.ai, which is a voice cloning tool, to copy the voice of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden to wish my dear friend a happy 60th birthday. And I wrote a funny script around it. So, look, they are ripping fun, but equally, voice cloning, I mean, that's terrifying. It's like the deep fake visual technology. Any of our voices could be scraped and put on social media. We could be made to say something we didn't actually say, and that just erodes people's trust in democracy, unfortunately. So what I try to do, aside from my friend's 60th birthday where I was naughty, is to use all these tools, teach them to be just that little bit better, but also take the benefits while trying to reduce the bias, the inequity, the misinformation, the disinformation, and the hallucinations. Because every time you use them, you learn something. And the optimistic part of me thinks we will be able to move towards something called a protopia, which is not utopia, where everything is wonderful, and not dystopia, the end of humanity, but using technology as a tool to move towards more equity, more kindness, and a fairer future for all.
Yeah, I like that. Protopia. I need to find out more about that. It does strike me, when I look at our kids, we're probably the last generation who will know what's real and what's not, where you know that a song has been created by a human, where you know that a piece of art was created by a human. And that opens up, a can of worms, because as somebody who's not particularly artistic, and I'm not a musician, I love that I can now take what's in my head and create in ways that I've never been able to before. I've created amazing anthems for both of my children. They walk around the house singing their songs. It's all about them. It's really uplifting and motivating, and if they're having a tough day, they find themselves singing their little songs. And I would never have been able to do that without AI. So I love the ability to increase our creativity in that way. But I do wonder, do you feel like AI is going to make us smarter, or, I don't like the word dumber, but less intelligent over time?
I don't think it will necessarily make us dumber. I think there's always a problem when you outsource your thinking, that you don't have that habit, that strengthening the neural pathways that critical thinking brings to us all. We're already seeing things like watermarking on AI created music, artwork, and pieces of creative writing. I know on Instagram now it asks you, was this created by AI? And I know that's self-regulation. We need more external regulation. But we are moving towards an era of more transparency around artificial intelligence. And that starts with conversations and education. My main issue in the creative area is not that we'll lose the capacity for creative thought, it's that copyright will continue to be breached in the creative sectors, because it is wonderful that these tools are cheap, sometimes free to access, but hopefully some of the legal actions that are happening at the moment, particularly in the States, will set a precedent where creatives can be paid even a small amount for their work that's been stolen. And then it's win-win. People are paid for their work and other people can access that to use in their own creative endeavours.
Yeah, and that's one that I flip-flop on and feel positive and negative about at the same time, because on the one hand, these models have trained on people's work and they're not replicating it, but using it for inspiration. But I think the problem becomes that these platforms are monetizing that and are making an billions of dollars, making an extraordinary amount of money from that process. So it will be really interesting to see how some of these legal cases unfold. But I do think that, AI is going to be a massive disruption for copyright and IP, and they're looking at legislation in the US where you can't patent a product that has predominantly been made by AI. So what does that mean for companies who are empowering their staff to use AI to develop products, and then they can't be patented? So it will be fascinating to see how that unfolds over time.
Exactly, because if part of it or most of it, like you say, was created by AI, it's not human. And so you can't patent something that's been not created by a human. Look, I'm delighted that we're living at this time in history where we're talking about the essence of humanity. What does it mean to be human? These are the big questions that we've grappled with for millennia, but it's really at the pointy end now, isn't it? If we're looking at sentience happening with robots, the last prediction I saw was around about 2050. That's pretty soon. So I'm really glad we're having these discussions now.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being willing to have them. So as we wrap up, Tracey, I want to ask you, when you stand on the hill, and I think the hill's becoming lower and lower in terms of how far out we can see at the moment, but what do you see coming? What do you see, maybe what you're most excited about in terms of what's coming down the line?
From everything I'm reading, quantum computing is going to be the next game changer as that advances exponentially in the next 2 to 5 years. But around artificial intelligence, I am optimistic that we'll see more regulation and legislation. I think we'll see an explosion in ethics, the use of responsible AI. Well, it's similar to when smoking came out, right? It took a while for there to be more regulation and legislation on the tobacco companies, particularly selling to children. Big tech is a little like big tobacco. And like you said, it's the Wild West at the moment. We will see more guardrails and people will be able to use AI more safely without fear and to create a better world for all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracey, for being here today. I'm incredibly grateful for your time and for this conversation. And maybe we can talk again in 12 months and see what's evolved in that time, because it's one of the things I'm excited about with this podcast is we'll be able to look back in 12 months' time and go, did we have it right? Did we? Did we?
I love that. It's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you for all of your phenomenal work.
Thank you, Tracey.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the AI Grapple. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. We would love to hear your thoughts, so reach out with any questions or comments about the show. Until next time, keep grappling with AI and stay curious.